Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to season 3 of the Profit Power Hour presented by Profit Coach. So glad to have you joining us today to talk about 8 client experience milestones every PM should measure, benchmark, and crush. This is episode 4 of Profit Power Hour season 3. And I am super excited to bring this content to you today. This is something that I have been thinking about, we've been thinking about, dreaming about for years. And probably Peter and Brad, who are PM operators or former operators, have been dreaming about it for even longer than I have. And if you're on the call today and you've been doing property management for any length of time, you are probably in the same boat of having thought about how you measure client experience and how we can actually do this, not just internally inside of our own companies, but more broadly across the industry. That's what we're talking about today. But of course, always like to know that you're here with us live. So jump into chat. Tell us where you're tuning in from. And you know what? Let's get a little bit of a weather check. I know that's the corniest of all icebreakers, but I've never used it before on this session before. And so just get us a little bit of a cloudy and overcast, sunshiny, rainy, and tell us where you're tuning in from today. All right, we are going to have a fantastic conversation with some fantastic panelists. Peter Lohman, broker CEO of RL Property Management, and also author at peterlohman.com. Peter produces a fantastic property management newsletter. If you're not subscribed, go to peterlohman.com to get subscribed for weekly content. And in addition to that, we've got Brad Johnson. Brad, this is welcome, man. This is your first time on a Profit Coach Power Hour. Brad is my new boss, CEO here at Profit Coach. And I'm excited to have his experience on today. Brad is former CEO of Sawyer Property Management in Wilmington, North Carolina, and brings a ton of PM experience to the table as well. And then myself, Daniel Craig, author of the NARPM Accounting Standards and Chief Strategy Officer here at Profit Coach. All right, if you've got questions, if you want to banter, dialogue, put the questions in the Q&A box so I can be sure and get those. But if you want to dialogue and interact with what we're talking about today, encourage you to light up chat so that we can make this very interactive. All right, talking about 8 client experience milestones every PM should measure, benchmark, and crush. And we've been having Profit Power Hours in the context of financial discussions for a really long time. But today we're moving a bit more operational. And so the goal for today's webinar is to help you move and have a transformation of mindset around your operational thinking, not just your perspective on finance, but your perspective on operations, to help you move from operational fog to operational clarity, from gut-based decision-making to data-driven management in your business, and ultimately from mediocrity to benchmark success. And when I say benchmark success, I actually mean beating operational metrics and operational benchmarks. And if you're like, well, what are the operational benchmarks? You showed up to the right place. We're going to be talking about that today. All right. Are you ready? Let's dive in. I want to start with a poll and get some feedback from our panelists as well on this. And the question being, how do you currently measure client experience? And when I say client, I mean owner and resident experience. Gut feel, surveys, NPS, CSAT, customer satisfaction, or CES, which stands for customer effort scoring, or just based off of our reviews. And then lastly, it's not something we pay attention to. Let's dive in. Peter, what's your answer to this question? And maybe just tell us a little bit about your evolution on this over time.
Yeah, absolutely. So my answer is NPS. We use an NPS surveying software to send out NPS surveys to our owners and our residents every 4 months. If you're not familiar, NPS stands for Net Promoter Score. And if you've gotten a survey that says, how likely are you to recommend our company to a friend or colleague, 0 through 10, that's what NPS is. So, and you survey your customers and they give you these ratings, and there's a formula, and in the end you're left with a score that ranges from negative 100 to positive 100, with positive 100 being the best. And so we've been doing this for a few years, so we have historical we have historical data, and we're able to see over time, have our residents become more or less satisfied with our management company since we did X, or since we changed this fee, or what have you. Same thing for our property owners. How have our property owners felt about our company over time? It's one thing to get a snapshot, but it becomes way more powerful when you can measure this in time. So I'm a huge believer in this, and I guess the way I put this is like, how do you know how your customers feel about your company? It seems like it should be something that's pretty important. And if you're not doing it in any type of a formal way, you're operating with less information than you could be.
Peter, one question came in here from Michael. Do you use a certain platform for the NPS survey? Just quickly.
We do. I've tried a couple. The one we've landed on that I like a lot is called Retently, Retently. It's the idea is you're retaining your customers by measuring, how they feel about you. We actually have all of the responses piped into our Slack. So every time we get a rating from a resident or a property owner, along with the comment, that pops right into 2 different Slack channels where our team can kind of have like a real-time feed on sort of like the vibes of how our customers are feeling about us.
Good feedback. Looking at the poll here, it looks like it's interesting spread. About 15% of people are using NPS on the call here today. 69%, the vast majority of people, are using reviews as the basis for their kind of measuring of client experience. And then about 21% gut feel, and 2% not measuring. So Brad, I kind of want to expand the question, and there's customer experience, but more broadly, like the whole question of like, are we doing a good job? Like, what is your perspective on how that's generally answered by PMs? How you guys tried to answer that? And what data you guys had available to you to answer those kinds of questions?
Sure thing. So to start, we also used NPS. I don't remember what the software tool we used, but it was something very similar to what Peter used. Just a couple things about NPS before I answer your broader question. The first one is I like it because it's really hard to get a great score. You don't get credit for NPS unless you get a 9 or a 10. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, but I think an 8 falls in neutral. Maybe it's a 7, but I think the threshold is 8. So if your customer says that you were an 8 out of 10 experience, you don't get any credit for that. So to get a score above 0 is actually pretty good. I'll ask you in a minute, Peter, what your benchmarks were, because I'm very curious to compare them to mine. But anyways, so hard score, you only get credit for the high numbers. The other thing that I think is really good to do with NPS is if you use EOS and you have weekly L10 meetings with your portfolio managers, your property managers, make them report on their NPS scores tied to their properties on a weekly basis. There's a lot of accountability that comes with having to actually say the number out loud, having to put it on your spreadsheet or in your software, and actually say to the team, this is what my owners and my tenants think about how likely they would be to recommend our service, which is based a lot around what I do, to their friends and family.
That's really good.
So,
and to your point, Brad, let me just insert one thing. That is a little bit of my concern with using reviews as your customer experience metric, because generally speaking, people that are big into reviews are using something of a cherry picking approach to collecting reviews, right? You send them an email that says thumbs up, thumbs down. If it's thumbs down, you send them to your comment box. If it's thumbs up, then you send them to the review platform. So it's a valuable way to manage reputation, but I think it's less valuable in terms of actually measuring experience.
Yeah, I would agree with that statement. NPS doesn't lie because everyone gets the NPS.
Yeah.
And probably people who have had a bad experience are slightly more likely to actually respond to it. So
Yeah.
further making it more difficult to get a great score. Though we did quite a bit at Sawyer of reaching out to people if they hadn't given us an NPS score in a while, in order to update it, to keep it fresh. I think our rhythm was every 6 months. Peter's was every 4. So the other point to that, Danny, is Google reviews are usually one time. It's a snapshot in time. NPS is constantly, and you will see people change their scores up and down as their experience changes.
Yep.
Yeah.
I can echo all of that. I'll get really vulnerable and share our actual numbers.
That's why we're here.
So there's a lot of ways you can look at this. You can look at like from all time. You can look at trailing 12 months. You can look at trailing 90 days. If we go back 12 months and look at those scores, our resident NPS is 15 and our client NPS is 23. Now, bear in mind, these are negative 100 to positive
Those are
100.
great scores.
And they sound low, but if you do research on NPS scoring and what's a good score and what's a great score, I'm not happy with where these are at. I'd like them to be higher, but they're not horrific either. And look, the data doesn't lie, right? It's good to know. Like, I'd rather know if we have an issue with resident and property owner happiness or satisfaction rather than just pretending that, well, how could they not be happy? Look at how great we are.
Yeah. Awesome. All right, guys. Thank you so much. We have a ton to cover here. So everybody, if I have a reputation for talking fast, it's going to expand on that today. All right. So let's dive in. What we're talking about is the game of experience. And this is something that historically we have measured in this industry using the metric of churn. When we first started benchmarking churn in 2018, the average was 25%. Last benchmark study shows that churn is 20%. And obviously, this is a metric for owner experience, not resident experience specifically. And then when we look at the top 25% of performers, in 2018, the people with the lowest churn, top 25%, averaged 12%, and that went all the way down to 10% in 2022. So if you see the average and benchmark there, people that are top performing are cutting churn in about half. Now, the question is how and why? And that's why we're talking about more granularly, what are the experience milestones that drive churn? That's the conversation for today. And I think the problem here is, and again, I'd like your feedback on this, Peter and Brad, is that yes, NPS is a way to measure the way people are feeling about your service. But more specifically, if you're actually looking at the quality of your property management work in terms of what you're doing, when, and how, there's a big question here in this industry that I don't feel like has a lot of good answers. And that is, how do you know if you're doing a good job? How do you know if you're doing a good job? And that's the question we are tackling. And kind of want to follow this up with, all right, that's the problem. But what if you could measure client experience at the process level and use that data to outperform your competition and prove it to your clients? Here's what we do in this process. Here's what our competition does. This is why you should buy from us. What if you could measure the efficiency of your core processes compared to your peers? This is what we do in terms of the overall timeline, speed of each of our core processes compared to industry. And then thirdly, what if you could measure the output of each individual team member on your team so that you can coach them into top performers? And this is like, what is Joe doing as a maintenance coordinator compared to all of the industry's maintenance coordinators? Guys, talk to me about this. Like, how does this land with you as property managers?
Yeah, I really want to highlight how difficult it is to know if you're doing a good job as a property manager. And I want to use a counter example. So Profit Coach, they do our corporate accounting, do an amazing job, love them. This isn't sponsored or anything, but I want to use an example of doing corporate accounting as like, how do I know if Profit Coach is doing a good job with our corporate accounting, or how does Profit Coach know? It's pretty straightforward. Do I have the financials by the 15th of the month or whatever the date is? Maybe it's the 8th. I can't remember. And were there any mistakes?
Yeah.
That's basically it. It's
Yeah.
like pretty, I'm sure there's a little bit of nuance there that you could
And
talk
did we
about.
steal from you this month or not?
Right. So that's like a really easy, not easy. It's not, what they do is not easy, but it's easy to know if they're doing a good job. When you are dealing with property management, I mean, think about how many metrics could go into, is my property manager doing a good job? How fast are they turning units? How fast are they leasing units? What's their lease renewal rate? What's their rent collection rate? What's their eviction rate? Did I get my disbursement on time? How much was my disbursement? How good is their vendor sourcing? How quickly they're executing work orders? How happy are the residents? Like, this is just off the top of my head, guys. Like, I could list 35 metrics that our clients may be judging us on or maybe evaluating our performance against. And so what we're attempting to quantify here is not easy. And that everything we're going to talk about today might not be the beginning and the end of this discussion. In fact, I'm sure it won't be.
Yeah.
But we got to start somewhere. We got to figure out, like, how are our customers, how are they receiving what we're doing? Like, what matters to them? What do they say matters? What actually matters? Is this a regional thing? Like, are there some areas that we can let go so that we have more resources to focus on the things that actually do matter to them? I don't know.
Yeah, and I would just add that there are a lot of metrics. There's a lot you could choose from. We need to define what the most important ones are, where the most value is added, or where the most constraint has to be overcome. And in the absence, I actually think the benchmarking portion of this is maybe the most important part, or at least one of the most important parts. In the absence of benchmarking, and in the absence of actually data-driven benchmarking, the benchmark that you might use and that your owner, client, or tenant might use could be totally different, and they're very arbitrary. At best, it's an educated guess, and at worst, it's just a gut feeling. So we have to have some sort of standard that we can say pretty definitively to our client base, this is the standard and this is where we perform. So you can know where we are based on the rest of the industry.
Love that, Brad. That was like a softball across center plate. We have to
almost
have
like I knew what we were going to talk about today.
Almost like you knew where we were going.
And
that brings us, ladies and gentlemen, to introducing the PM operations standards. And this is a universal standard to determine if you're doing a good job. I try to boil this down as simply as I can. Like, we want to know, are we doing a good job? That's what the PM operations standards are all about. And this is what we're going to unpack. And I'm not going to like just talk about this. I'm actually going to show you what we developed last week at Broker Owner. We got together in the Process Lounge, which was hosted by Profit Coach and Lead Simple, and had conversations with sticky notes on the wall about what are the key milestones that are common to the property management core processes across the globe, across the board, because we all have variances in the way we do things, but there are key milestones that are common to all property managers. What are those? And then once we know what those are, what are the metrics that need to be defined as a result of those milestones? We had real live stand-up conversations unpacking this with sticky notes on the wall. You can see some pictures, and what I'm about to share with you is what came out of those discussions. Now, before we dive into that, we're going to talk about 8 core processes and the specific milestones we discussed and the metrics that came out of these discussions. I want to just review this framework of data-driven process design that I touched on back in March in our last Profit Power Hour, because this really is the context for how we're thinking about property management operation standards. Our goal at Profit Coach is to help our team, our clients, your teams, and your clients, owners and residents, become and achieve more. We call that BAM. And in order to do that, there's 2 BAM cycles or value creation cycles for owners and residents, and also your team, that are based on this idea of data-driven process design. And I'm going to fly through this, but this is essentially a framework that's guiding the way that we're going about thinking about property management operation standards. Here's how property management works and how we think it needs to work to drive increased experience. Property managers solve problems. And the best way they can do that is leveraging what we're calling data-driven process design. And what I mean by that is to, on a process by process level, have the ability to define, measure, and benchmark the key elements and metrics of your process, the key milestones of any core process. And based off of that measurement and that benchmark and the ability to compare what you're doing to what the industry's top performers are doing, based off of that, distill best practices from the measurements, from your feedback loop that will help you improve your process, communicate your value to your clients, and ultimately create new and additional value for your owners and residents. Okay. And it's this define, measure, and benchmark process that is what the PM operation standards are all about. That's on the value creation side for owners and residents. But the same is true for the team. How can we measure and benchmark and define best practices of team performance that will allow us to improve processes, to allow our teams to be more efficient, to coach them into top performers, and ultimately allow us to expand our team, create new opportunities for our team to deliver value to owners and residents. Okay. It's this define, measure, benchmark, best practice concept that is the basis of how this industry has taken giant steps forward in terms of financial performance. And now the time has come to do this on the operational side of things. Make sense? Everybody give me a virtual head nod. All right. So what we're talking about is a framework that gets to the core milestones and metrics that we can actually measure across the board despite our unique ways of doing things. And really there's three types of milestones in any process. There's all the individual steps, but what are the key bottlenecks or key constraint milestones that are really critical to making sure the process is flowing on time? What are the key value milestones? What are the key points in the process that deliver meaningful value to owners and residents? And then completion milestones. What's the goal of the process that really delivers that final pop of value to owners and residents? We took the time to look at 8 core processes last week at Broker Owner and identify these, and that's what I'm about to share with you. And then from a metrics perspective, once you have those milestones, what are the key operational and real-time metrics that need to be measured to actually understand if you're doing a good job? And I want to just touch on the hierarchy of insight. Essentially, most business owners go into business and they measure their business performance by their bank balance, okay? Do I have money in the bank today? It's a good day. Do I not have money? It's a bad day. Profit Coach came into the property management industry and helped put forward with NARPM a set of financial metrics to get more sophisticated about the inside of your business. But now what we're talking about is operational metrics that define if you're doing a good job and real-time metrics that tell you if you're doing what you need to do today for everything to flow correctly from there. All right. So what we call these operational metrics and what we call these real-time metrics specifically is SIGI metrics. And I'm bringing this to you now because in the slides I'm about to show you, I'm going to show you 4 different types of key metrics. One of those is SIGI metrics, which stands for Can I Go Home Yet? This tells your team what needs to be done today in order to win, in order to deliver that quality experience that you're trying to deliver to your owners and residents. And so the 4 types of metrics are SIGI metrics. This is real-time data for your team to make sure they're doing the key things today that are going to move the processes along at a rate that will deliver the client experience and the outcomes that are measured in outcome metrics. That's number 2. Number 3 would be performance metrics. And this is essentially what is the quality of the work that the team has done. And that's also related to obviously outcome metrics for the clients, but performance metrics are a little bit more team oriented. And then finally, experience metrics such as NPS, CSAT, customer effort scoring. Brad, Peter, I'm going to pause there. Is this making sense so far? Any questions, clarifications?
Makes sense to me.
Okay.
Peter?
It's a little fuzzy, but I think it's going to come into focus as we move to the next section here and start to get a little more concrete.
All right, great. That's what we're doing right now. So what we're going to talk about is 8 processes and the key milestones that, based on conversations with quite a few property managers last week at Broker Owner, there was a good deal of consensus around both the metrics and the milestones that should be measured as part of these processes. Now, is this final? Is this like ultimately conclusive? No, we're gonna have more data in order to be able to come up with ultimate opinions on these things. But we're gonna start. Owner onboarding and property onboarding we looked at together, and we really looked at in terms of 3 key milestones. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but the milestones that we looked at specifically are, number 1, sign PMA, right? It all starts there. That's day 0. Initial property inspection, and this is something that we had a good bit of discussion about. Some people do this after they sign the PMA. Some people do this in the sales process before they sign the PMA, but there's an initial property inspection that happens very early on for all property managers. And then finally, all owner and property info collected. This is number 3. This is a major constraint, just getting the information from the owners about the property, from the owners about their whatever specific owner information you need. And then finally, the last milestone in this would be getting all of the information in the property management software. And none of these are particularly like value milestones. All of these are really just constraint milestones. And so we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this initial property inspection milestone is really critical because this triggers a lot of other processes. It triggers marketing if the property is determined to be move-in ready. It triggers your make ready or turnover process if it's not move-in ready, or it triggers pre-marketing if you're pre-marketing during the turnover. I'm going to move on, guys, unless you have any comments or questions on this. Okay, well, we're going to roll. So the next step here is really the first process where you begin to deliver some value to the owners, and that is the turnover process. You can call it a turnover, you can call it a make ready. We had some good discussion on which it is. And ultimately, I think probably the most sophisticated answer is, well, it's a make ready the first time and it's a turnover between tenants after that. But we're just going to call it a turnover. All right, so the milestones that we discussed here are, number 1, request bids. And these are days from the initial property inspection. So once that property inspection happens, 1 day later, you should be able to request bids. Now, we're going to have some discussion about that in just a moment, but I'm going to move through this. Day 5, send the estimate to the owner. Day 12, have owner approval and funds received. And by the way, these are not like final, like this is just an initial take on what the timeline can look like, but this has to be benchmarked. Day 13, vendors assigned. Day 18, work completed. Day 19, final inspection approved. Now, the green milestones here are what we are considering to be valuable points in the process where value is delivered to the owners, specifically for estimates sent to owners. The way that you are negotiating your vendors and setting expectations around the cost of the turnover is going to be communicated in this spot. And then at the end of the process, the final inspection is going to determine your quality of work and your ability to actually deliver a valuable owner to tenants or to owners. So we're going to talk about the metrics here in just a moment. Guys, any comments, questions on this timeline here?
So this all makes sense to me. The question of like, when does this timeline start? Mm-hmm. Like it's kind of clear when you're getting a new property, right? It's what you talked about on the previous slide. Mm-hmm. But when you have a resident who's vacating or you have an eviction, does this start on the day they told you they moved out? Does it start on the day of the setup for the eviction? Does it start when you get the keys? Does it start so those details I think will matter a lot. Mm-hmm. And I think we'll be able to build a consensus around it. But that matters a lot, right? So when someone says, "Oh, our average turn time is 9 days," I'm like, "Well, yeah, but you're counting from when you got owner approval. Like that's not that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the overall turn, including like how long it took you to get all the information to the owner, and how long did it take the owner to approve it and fund it and everything else. So now I know there's people in our industry who do like 5-day turns. Like everything shown on the slide is done within 5 days. I've talked to these people and I've grilled them because I just
Yeah.
can't believe how good they are, but they are that good, right?
Hmm.
This is going to be like the top 5 or 10% of, like just like the same as we look at DLER, right? There's people with DLERs over 4 and you're like, holy cow, some people are really good in certain areas. So what can we learn from them? What are some of the best practices we can take and put back into our own property management operations? But until we know where we stand, we don't know what to work on. And
And
that's
one
what
of the
we're going to figure out.
Yeah, and one of the points of discussion on this process specifically was, hey, one of the people said, I all of my terms and vendors are pre-negotiated in the PMA. Like when I sign a PMA, the owner knows exactly what the pre-negotiated pricing is, and that cuts 7 days out of this process for me. I don't have to go through an owner approval process. That's done immediately. And to Todd's point in chat, vendors are assigned much, much more quickly as a result of that. So that was like one interesting thing that came out of the discussion is like, are you pre-negotiating this with your vendors and owners, or is that happening in the term process?
Yeah,
It looked like you wanted to say something.
sure. So first of all, I'm very interested, maybe more than any of the other ones. I am interested to see what the industry standard turnover time is. What
Yeah.
is the median? What is that top quartile? I'm very curious. We had a 14-day standard, and we would push for 10 as much as possible. And most of the time, we were able to achieve a 10-day turn. So that was a good thing. I'm curious to see if that's good, bad. I don't really know.
Yeah.
My other comment was we built as much authority into the turnover process as possible in the PMA, so that we, as little as possible, would we have to reach out for. I've heard
Yes.
I've heard about this Boston thing that just
Oh my
that
God, Boston.
I we got to talk about that in a second. Um, I wanted as little communication with the owner in this process as possible, and as much pre-approval to assign and perform the turn work as possible as soon as we knew the turn was occurring. And then we would have standard turnover pricing and we would have standard turnover vendors. So it was just, oh, a turn's coming, boom, it's going to be this, it's going to this person, it's going to cost this much, go do it, 5 to 10 days, done. That's obviously there are edge cases, but there is a way to get this in that 5 to 10 days for sure.
Yeah. So what Brad's talking about there is strategies to improve this, right? And I can't wait to get into these deep discussions with my peers about the strategies that they're using. Think back to several years ago when we were all having these strategic discussions around how to raise our revenue per door or how to increase our DLER, right? Those conversations only became possible when we had a standard terminology and defined KPIs that we could all agree on. This is what this is, and here's what it is at my company. So I cannot overstate the importance of standardizing the terminology and definitions and the ways that we're measuring these things. I mean, I would venture to say that 98% of property management companies do not have good data on their own turn times, average turn time, median turn time, trailing 30, trailing 90, year to date, trailing 12 month. Do you know that data for your business? We don't. We know some of it.
Mhm.
So, like, we can't even measure this internally. We don't even know if we're getting better or worse, let alone what our peers are doing, what the best in the industry are doing. And only when all of that foundation is laid can we then have productive discussions about tactics and cool stuff like Brad was talking about. And like some of the folks in chatter are already sharing some of the strategies that they use to improve turn time. And I'm just like so excited about the ability to like have a conversation around that stuff where we're comparing apples to apples.
Yeah. Agreed. And Todd's, making a point. He's been part of the NARPM Technology Committee, and the difficulty of getting agreement on this. And I think that part of the reason that it's difficult to get agreement is because we're not first having a discussion around what the milestones are that we're measuring against. And so That's where we're starting, is looking at milestones and then working off of metrics from there. So let's talk metrics. Specifically, we identified a bunch of metrics for each of these milestones, but what we're going to focus on today for the sake of time is the metrics around the value milestones that we have on this in the green spots on the screen. And I want to focus, just for sake of time, on a couple of these. An outcome metric for estimate sent to owner would be just measuring the number of days between inspection, where it was determined that a turnover needed to occur, to actually creating an estimate and sending that to the owner. And then looking at if you have that sort of benchmark of a milestone of what needs to be true for you to deliver a quality experience, how many turns are over that benchmark of X days from inspection? Let's move on to this one over here. SIGI metrics. 0 work orders incomplete on the due date. All right. And this is going to tie a little bit more to this milestone, but I want to just put it out here. Making sure that the team is looking at the due date on the work orders in such a way that they're following up on those to make sure that there's 0 work orders incomplete on the due date, or that the due date is being adjusted based on communication with the vendor. Number of days from inspection, measuring that as the total time of a turn. Number of, and again, this would be an initial make ready scenario. Number of turns over X days from inspection. And specifically what that is like, hey, we have a threshold of, let's say, we've been talking about, is it 5? Is it 10? Whatever it is for you, how many turns are over 10 days? And having that clarity to know exactly which turns are off track. And then experience metrics, owner NPS, CSAT, customer effort scoring. Peter, would you send out NPS requests on turns? Is this something you would measure from a NPS perspective?
It's not something we currently do, but what you're describing is like life cycle NPS surveying, where you survey, like the example I always go to is like resident. You survey the resident 3 days after move-in, 60 days after move-in, 90 days before renewal, 5 days after renewal, 2 weeks after they gave notice to vacate, 3 weeks after they moved out. And then if you plot all that, right, you could see this like graph going up and down showing like their satisfaction level over the life cycle of that customer or that resident. I think that's amazing. I would love to be doing that. We're not currently doing it though.
Yeah. And what we envision is a world in which standard points for NPS measurement are agreed upon, such that you can say, we measured NPS at the end of the turn, and this is what our NPS, turn-specific NPS is relative to the industry.
Yep.
You really get excited about that? Man, that just jazzes me. All right, let's talk about marketing. Again, there's debate about where marketing starts. But some people pre-market, and so that's going to be a factor in basically determining the start point of your marketing process. And what we look at specifically in marketing here is the owner experience. Applications, what we're going to get to in just a moment, is a little bit more of a reflection of the resident experience. But the milestones here are owner approval or notification of market rate. This was a discussion on the floor at Broker Owner. Some people were like, hey, why don't you even get owner approval? Like, hey, that's just our decision. And we tell them a little bit what we expect in the sales process, but they don't get to have a say in this. That's an interesting way to tighten the timeline on this. Property listed, day 4. And the idea here is we're measuring this specifically from the make ready completion inspection, right? So this is, again, a rough number of days that this has to be benchmarked. First application received, maybe 3 days from property listed, and then lease signed, maybe 18 days. All right. Now, we obviously know this is seasonal, varies by market. These are just basic numbers. But the key thing here is, what are the metrics that are related to each of these milestones? So for property listed, the SIGI metric, the can I go home yet metric for your marketing team would be 0 unlisted units 5 days from inspection or 4 days from inspection, right? Once that move out inspection occurs, or sorry, the turnover inspection is completed and approved, property's on the market within X days. and you can't go over that. That's the kind of real-time visibility that will help drive outcomes for your team. The outcome metric is what actually happened. How many days is it from property final inspection on the turn to actual property listing? And a performance metric would be, how many units are actually over that threshold. And then moving on to lease signed, which is obviously a little bit more of a significant owner experience metric. It's not a SIGI metric here since the lease is signed. But what we're looking at in terms of outcome metrics would be the number of days from the time that the unit was listed. I think this would be equivalent to what many people refer to as days on market. And then also, and I think, Todd, this addresses some of your question, like what do you measure? Some people just want to measure different things, right? And so you can actually allow for different metrics. I think an interesting thing to measure here would be what is the number of days from the signing of the PMA to the time that the lease was signed minus your turn with and without your turn time. Okay. So there's different ways that you could look at this and basically say you can cater to people's different preferences and different processes by offering several different metrics to measure. Performance metric here would be, hey, how many unleased units are currently over 5 days or 20 days, whatever the number is for you from listing. And then, of course, I think this is a huge opportunity to measure customer experience, owner NPS, CSAT, customer effort scoring. Thoughts, comments? Nodding the heads. We're going to move on.
I think like one point is Todd kind of mentioned this. I want to highlight step one of, and this stemmed from your comment, Daniel. Step one is defining the milestones. Excuse me. So just like you were saying, once the milestones are defined, you can measure different, like from here to there, add these together, minus that. But you can't do any of that till you define the milestones.
Yeah, right. Yep, 100%. Okay, we're going to keep moving along here. Applications, and guys, we will send out the slides afterwards. What this is intended to do is to get in front of you some of the key milestones that we had a good amount of consensus on, what we think are some key measurements, so that you can begin to look at how can we elevate these metrics to our team and make these numbers more visible to our team. We're going to talk about applications here for just a moment. So day 0, application submitted. Day 2, all documents collected. Day 3, application verified. Day 4, applicant approved or denied. We believe that this is a value milestone because this is part of resident experience. How quickly did they get back to me and approve or deny my application? Day 7, deposit received and lease signed. Some kind of deposit received at the timing of the lease. And then day 8, lease setup in PMS. So what would the metrics be here for this particular value milestone, which we have in green? 0 applications over 5 days from submission, right? Like this is a real metric. How many applications do you have in queue that are right now over 5 days? Your team should have this number down to 0 by the end of every day, or 4, whatever it is for your company. Outcome metric would be, what is the average time it takes us to approve or deny an application? And then right now, how many actual applications do we have over 5 days from submission, which is really the same thing as the SIGI metric here. And then, Peter, what are your thoughts? Is this another opportunity to do resident NPS scoring, or do you pretty much just do this at the end of the lease process? I'm thinking it's probably a little bit more at lease, or maybe even at move-in. Your thoughts?
So I do know that a lot of sophisticated operators use the your application has been approved milestone to request a review, because they know that that is a sort of a peak in the life cycle NPS score for a resident. I think that's super smart, right? Like they've just been approved, nothing's gone wrong yet. Let's capture that Google review. So yeah, I think NPS surveying, I mean, it would be a good way to get feedback from your residents on the application process, like how that experience was for them. So that would be really interesting to sort of watch that over time. So let's pretend that you have data going back 1 year on resident NPS scores at the moment their application was approved. Now you decide to integrate a new technology that handles your rental application differently or uses a different method for approval, or what have you. You have a bunch of vendors that handle application processing. Then 90 days after you roll out that vendor, you can see, is this better for residents? Is this worse for residents? Or am I willing to accept a 10-point NPS drop from residents in exchange for saving my company 80 hours a month on the application process? But again, in the absence of data, we're just guessing on all this stuff.
Yeah. Awesome. Let's move on. And we've made it through 4 of 8 processes. We're going to cruise through some of the last 4 here. But if you're like, this is interesting, how do I actually implement this in my business? How do I actually set up data-driven process design in my company? What does that look like? How can I set up my processes so that I can actually measure this and get this kind of data? I want to invite you to a deep dive that we're doing with Lead Simple on this topic of data-driven process design. The next part where we really take the outcomes of our broker owner discussion on the PM operations standards and break this into practical ramifications for process design and implementation is May 15th, 12 p.m. And if you are interested in being part of that webinar, it's free. Just say yes to the poll that I just threw up, and we'll be happy to add you automatically to the registration for that on May 15th, 12 p.m. Central. And a few familiar faces: Peter Lohman, Zach Berkumpus, Wolfgang Krosky, Angie Ferris, myself, digging into this even more. All right, so let's talk now about move-ins. We're going to move a little bit more quickly through this. And in this case, we're measuring back from transfer of possession. So roughly, 5 days or before, we're going to have a transfer of utilities complete. 2 days before the transfer of possession, we're going to have the move-in evaluation complete. Some people will do this at the same time as their transfer of possession. I know one company that basically has the inspector actually open the doors on the day of transfer of possession, walk through the property, and that serves as the move-in evaluation and the tenant signing off on that. And so obviously the final milestone here would be of transfer of possession. And an outcome metric would be, what is the number of days from move out possession to move in possession? And this is what I believe is the metric for days vacant. I believe days vacant is keys to keys, possession to possession. And this is how I believe we can solve discussions around what is days vacant. In my opinion, it's possession to possession. And what that looks like is a specific step in your process where you have determined that you actually have possession. Again, I think this would be a significant owner, or rather resident experience opportunity. And I know some people take advantage of this and some people don't. I know people who, show up with the resident, walk them through the property. There's a gift basket. It's a very high touch experience. That's an interesting opportunity to measure resident experience. We're going to move on to lease renewal. And again, this is milestones measured before the lease end date. Some people start this process at 90 days, maybe 120 days. Probably not less than 60 days is best practice. 60 days beforehand, you have a renewal assessment complete. 55 days, you have owner approval of market rate. Again, if you're even getting owner approval. 50 days, you have a renewal offer presented to the tenant. And then hopefully by, let's say, day 45 before the lease end date, the lease is renewed, or there's a notice to terminate the lease. So what we're looking at in terms of metrics for this value milestone would be 0 assessments incomplete 60 days before lease end. All right. Like, this is a metric you could give to your team to make sure that they're on track with this timeline. Then actually measuring, what is the number of days before lease end date for which we on average complete our renewal assessments. And then a performance metric would be, currently how many assessments are incomplete under 60 days before the lease end date. All right, so that would be on that milestone. We consider that to be a value milestone because the way that the actual renewal assessment is done and the ability to drive increased or optimal rents for your tenants, or rather for your owners, is a value. And then the other milestone here being lease renewed, 0 unclosed renewals 45 days before lease end date. That means they've either accepted or rejected the renewal offer. The outcome metric would be the number of days before lease end date that we actually, on average, complete the renewal process. And then obviously significant metric would be renewal rate. It's amazing to me how significant your renewal rate is. And yet this is a metric that, in my experience, probably less than 10% of companies actually measure in this industry. Performance metrics would be, again, how many open renewals do we have under 45 days? And then another opportunity to measure both owner and resident NPS. Thoughts on this, guys, before I move on?
What do you think, Brad?
Yeah, I'm trying to just assess this in general. I think that this will be another interesting place to see both the standardized days prior to lease end date that folks use, and really to get some good data on both the days in between the milestones. And also, I'm very curious to hear about lots of people have different strategies on how they go about securing as many lease renewals as possible over against there's this constant interplay between, do we want to renew the lease at a low renewal rate, which is usually a higher acceptance rate, or do we want to risk vacancy in order to get up to full market rent? I had that conversation with so many different people at Broker Owner, and it's so interesting, depending on your market dynamics, what strategy you take. And actually, the strategy that you employ that you think might be best is going to really play out in how you do this process, how many days you use, and what you build into your PMA and into your lease as far as automatic renewals. So there are a lot of good weeds to get into with lease renewal that I'm excited about.
Yeah, I really agree with that. The other interesting thing about lease renewals is it's kind of analogous to your churn. So if you do 1 over your churn, like if your churn is 22%, you do 1 over 0.22, that gives you the number of years that a client stays with you on average. Same thing with your lease renewal rate. If you do 1 over your give notice rate, that will tell you how long a resident stays with you on average, like in years. So that data is important for you to understand as a property management business owner, not only because clients ask about it quite a bit, but also because it helps you with financial forecasting so that you can understand how many lease renewal fees and how many leasing fees you're going to be collecting in any given year on average.
Yeah, great point. All right, so let's move on here to move outs. Real quickly, we are measuring this in relationship to the date of the transfer of possession. Transfer of utilities, maybe 3 days before transfer of possession, which happens on day 0. Day 3 from transfer of possession would be final move-out inspection, which we did think was a value milestone because it represents something of security to the owners in terms of the way that the property is being inspected and maintained. Final accounting, maybe day 20 from transfer of possession, and security deposit disposition complete 24 days, and certainly no later than 30 days in most states. And so, what would the metrics be for this final move-out inspection? Again, 0 incomplete move-out inspections 3 days after move-out. A number of days from move-out, measuring this as an outcome would be an outcome metric, and that's some interesting data on the move-out process. Now, let's move on to the big one. And this one probably generated some of the most debate in the hall, the work order process. So if you're feeling controversy or like your blood is rising as I go through this, just contribute. All right. We're taking all of this in stride. So the steps that we outlined were, number 1, validating the request. Day 1, 1 day from the submission of the work order, 4 days into the process, you've collected bids and you've assigned a vendor. If you have owner approval, again, Todd's going to tell you to just jerk that out of your process. And obviously, a lot of you guys have basic minimums that you can operate with that you don't have to get approval for. But in case you do have owner approval, we kept that milestone in the process by day 6, owner funding by day 9, verification of work completed by day 14, final billing day 21, and work order closed day 22, and review requested. Some key value milestones in green, 0 unvalidated work orders 1 day from submission, the SIGI metric for this milestone. What is the actual number of days from submission that work orders get validated on average? And I think this is really interesting. What is your percent of validated work orders? Wouldn't that be interesting to know? I'm not sure which way that cuts. I can see arguments on that both ways, but certainly an interesting metric to measure. For collecting bids, 0 unassigned work orders, 4 days from submission, or whatever that target is for you. What is the actual number of days from submission would be some key metrics there. And then finally, for verification of work completed, 0 incomplete work orders on the due date, number of days from submission to the completion of work on average. And then performance metrics would be, what are the number of work orders over 14 days from submission, or whatever that benchmark is for you. And then measuring experience, resident experience, NPS, CSAT, customer effort scoring here. Thoughts on this, guys?
Yeah, the metric about like percent of work orders that were validated, 1 minus that, which is basically how many work orders did we head off before we sent out a vendor. That's really important for property owners to know. Like, yeah, we actually take time. We don't just blindly send out a plumber anytime a resident calls with a water leak. We actually look at, okay, what's going on? Basic troubleshooting. Is this a callback issue? Is there a warranty that would come into play here? So I think that's really powerful to be able to tell an owner, hey, 19% of work orders never even incur any cost to you. We handle that as part of our standard process.
Awesome. All right, for sake of time, we're going to boil this down into some next action steps here. What is needed in your business to give your team clarity so that they can win every day in your business and deliver this kind of experience to your owners and residents? We want to dig into this in more detail on the upcoming data-driven process design workshop that you guys signed up for. And then in addition to that, we want to offer you the opportunity to schedule a data-driven process design diagnostic with our team to get clarity on what's working or not working with your current processes, identify what needs to be true of your processes to accomplish your goals around experience while maximizing efficiency, and then revolutionize your workday by defining your "can I go home yet" SIGI metrics. You can define this. We've just given you the framework. We have a framework that we'd love to get on the phone with you and say, all right, for your core processes, what needs to be true from an owner experience perspective, and then what has to be done today for that to be true so that your team can win every day. What that looks like for us is giving your team visibility to, let me just throw this up here, visibility to your specific "can I go home yet" metrics. For clients that are on Lead Simple and are measuring these milestones in Lead Simple, we have the ability to provide them with a "can I go home yet" dashboard that basically shows what are the metrics that need to be at 0 by the end of the day. You can double click on any of the metrics and have the visibility that you need to know exactly what processes need to be addressed in order for you to stay on track with these "can I go home yet" metrics, which are going to drive the experience. First step is defining what those metrics are for you. And we just love to have a free consultation to help you get clarity so that you can measure that, whether that's with our tools or on your own. If that's of interest to you, just say yes to this poll. Now, if you're like, hey, I just said yes to this poll already, I actually threw up the wrong poll for the process workshop, but I got those results. This poll is the poll if you want to have one of these data-driven process design consultations one-on-one with our team to understand how you can supercharge your processes with data to help your team win every day. That's a one-on-one conversation with us. All right, let's wrap it up here, guys. And I just want to take this to some next steps in terms of a soft conversation around what do you do with this data? How do you actually interact with your team about this? Obviously, some of this is futuristic, but there's places to start today. Based on what you're hearing, Peter, what would you do with this information as a business owner and start applying it to drive experience in your company?
Well, if I wasn't already measuring NPS, I would probably get started on setting that up with Retently or another NPS provider. There's actually some significant work to get all that set up and working in a way that makes sense. And there's some best practices around that as well. That would be the first thing. The other thing I would be really taking time on is understanding where these milestones are in my business right now. Are these lead simple processes? Are these in Monday.com? Are these actually in Appfolio? Like, start to identify where these currently live so that you can begin to understand how you might measure them and potentially even update them to match some of the standard terminology and milestones that we're going to be agreeing on. So just kind of taking the lay of the land of how this is currently working inside your business.
I think one of the key things here is actually interacting with your team on this data. And I'm just going to throw up one last poll as we wrap up here. And the poll is, how frequently do you actually review operational performance metrics with your team? Daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually? Never. Brad, what are your thoughts on some best practices around using data with the team? You talked about the weekly level 10, bringing this in front of them in terms of NPS. But I think there's probably a lot of people that aren't measuring this and certainly aren't having data-driven management conversations with their team. Thoughts on how to take what we've talked about today and start meaningfully applying this to team conversations?
Yeah, I think that I would put it in two categories of where I would try to spend a lot of time thinking through it. The first one is accountability, and the second one is compensation. So in accountability, how could we develop a model within the business that shows a lot of different visibilities across these different processes and across performance for people who have the same job function? Not that everything's a contest, quote unquote, but there should be a standard for our business, and establishing that standard and making sure that our property managers and others are meeting that standard on a consistent basis. And if not, digging into the details and figuring out what can we do in order to raise the bar. And then the second one is I would start to think about how you might model compensation based on performance using these metrics. There are some metrics where it can be very much out of the PM's hand, but there are plenty of metrics where the PM controls almost the entire process. How can you incentivize your property managers with their compensation models to actually perform in a way that merits more or less money? I think that in general in property management, much of the way that we pay folks outside of salespeople is a bit of a guess or a market rate.
Yeah.
But I think most people want to be paid based on their performance. And I think that this is the beginnings of a larger conversation on performance-based compensation in property management.
I'm going to wrap up piggybacking off of that point. If you look at the results of this poll, notice what % of people are reviewing performance data with their team on a daily basis. Mic drop, 0%. To me, this is highlighting the power of can I go home yet metrics. Because what this means that all of the data conversations that we're having in this industry are too late. Let me say that again. All of the data conversations that we're having in this industry right now around operations are too late. Nobody's talking about what has to happen today to win. And that to me is what the power of Sigi metrics is. And to your point around performance-based compensation, Brad, one of the things that I'm excited about is just to bonus people or give them performance-based compensation around being in compliance every day. Like is your Sigi dashboard at 0 at the end of every day? And do that as a team. Are we actually collaborating as a team to get these glass balls handled every day on time so that we can win every day and deliver an incredible experience to our clients? All right. Super great stuff. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate the time. Up next, Wednesday, May 22 at 12 p.m. Central Time, episode 5 of the Profit Power Hour. And if you want to dive into data-driven process design even more, join us on our workshop in a couple of weeks, May 15th. I guess that would be 3 weeks exactly. May 15th, 12 p.m. Central. And until next time, thank you for everything you do to deliver an amazing experience to owners and residents all over this country. Brad, Peter, and everybody who contributed to the property management operations standards last week, thank you so much. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody.